Ashley, and today we're going to talk about negative space. So, a lot of painters or people that do art consider what they're going to paint and they think about vibrant colors, bold brushstrokes, but sometimes it's what you actually don't paint that can matter more to the composition and to the painting and to making your painting actually successfully illustrate what you want it to show. So today I'm going to show you some different examples of kind of how to use negative space in your artwork to make your art a little bit more elevated and successful. It is especially important in watercolor painting because you can't paint light over dark. So in watercolor painting, we do a lot of what is called negative painting. Negative painting is where you actually paint around the subject to then define the subject itself and help define the focal point. You can also use negative space in other ways, though, around your subject or in the background to let the eye rest and give your work space to make it not feel so cluttered and packed. And it really can elevate your work with the simplicity of it. So I have a few examples of my own artwork that I've done where I've used negative space successfully. And then I have a couple examples where I really didn't use it successfully. So if we look down at my painting table right now, I have a whole pile of paintings here. So the first one here, this is a painting that I did that we were looking at a whole series about color theory. So this was the final painting, but I think that it illustrates really well use of negative space in the water especially, but also in the sky. So you can see that I didn't worry about covering all of the white of the paper. And that actually effectively creates the illusion of water a lot more than if I had tried to paint all the ripples and use a white medium or a lighter blue or something like that to create that effect. Using the white of the paper and using that negative space effectively is what really makes this painting shine, I think. And then if we look at another example here, this is a white house. So again, in watercolor, we cannot paint white over dark colors. You would have to use an opaque medium. And if you don't want to do that, you need to use negative painting to create your white subjects. So I did the same thing in the water here in the lake where I did dry brushing and let the white of the page show. So that is, essentially negative space. And then for the house, I painted around it with all of these bushes and trees and everything to define the shape of the house. So again, that's an example of using negative painting or negative space as the focal point. Okay. So if we continue, I have another example where I did add some color into the water areas or this delta area to create a reflection of the sky, but essentially this is still negative space. So using that really helps to define, and it gives us high contrast between our lights and our darks. So using negative painting that way is another option to, again, elevate your paintings, especially in watercolor. Now, in terms of kind of an example where maybe I didn't do this as well. So I have this painting that was a spontaneous landscape that I did not use negative painting well. So you can see that, I do have some negative space down here that I think adds to the composition. I really like that negative space. It almost looks like the water is like splashing up over the foliage so you can't see it. It's obscuring it. And using that negative space well there is effective. But I did not do that for the waterfall, and I should have. So you can see the waterfall looks gray and murky and muddy, and that's because I didn't use any negative space there. And I painted over it with white gouache that just turned murky and muddy looking because it's painted over these darker colors, and it just doesn't work well. So there's an example of where, I did not use negative space effectively to create my subject. Okay, another example where it's a little bit different. So in my sketchbook here, I have this painting. Now, I like this painting because I did this on location. We went to the Grand Canyon for our spring break trip, and I sat down and painted this. And I'm really happy that I did it. Now, am I happy with the painting itself? Meh, it's okay. But the main reason that I don't like it, I think, is because it looks cluttered. It looks like I just threw everything down and it's messy and cluttered. And that's not because of the brush strokes or the techniques that I used. It's because I didn't incorporate really any negative space in this painting. There is a tiny bit in these background cliffs. There's a tiny bit in this cliff, but not much, a little bit over here. But again, for the most part, this page is covered with paint, and that can be effective, but in this composition, it was not. I think this would have been a lot more powerful if I would have just left all of this area unpainted and just done the cliff and like the foreground and maybe a little bit of background element. And then I could have maybe done like line drawings to distinguish the edge of this or like a path or something. But if I would have left this all as negative space, I think it would have been a much more powerful composition. So we're going to try that and just see how it works. And it could fail spectacularly. I'm saying that wrong still. It could fail and still not look good. But we're going to take this composition and try to play with it and see if we can incorporate a bunch of negative space and kind of elevate this painting a little bit. So we'll get to that in a moment. But some other examples here. Here's another example where there's a ton of negative space. Both of these, actually no. This one's the negative painting around the white. This one just has a ton of negative space. So there's a bunch of this that's unpainted, and it gives you that effect of a misty mountain morning. So using the negative space effectively can give you that simplicity that you might be searching for. Okay. And then here's just two more examples of, using negative space, again, to create water splashes and to create subjects that are white in our paintings, in watercolor specifically. So kind of the four main areas that negative space really helps with in your artwork is it can add depth, create depth. So if we think back to that misty morning painting, you can tell the layers of the hills because of the negative space. Another thing is it can allow the eye to rest and kind of decrease the clutter of the scene, which really creates balance in your artwork. So again, if we look at my composition from the Grand Canyon, there's no balance. It's all very heavy and it's all painted. And so it doesn't have a balance between light and heavy. And so negative space can really help create balance. Negative space can also really enhance your focal point. So by leaving areas unpainted, it draws the eye around the page in different ways to specify where the main focus of the painting is. And so using negative space to define your focal point is very effective. And then also negative space can really give your shapes a lot more meaning, and it can add emotion and depth into your work in that way. So if you have a landscape that has very little actual positive space where you've actually painted and a lot of negative space, it can feel quiet and isolated and peaceful, or it can feel lonely or moody. So you can use that negative space to enhance the emotional impact of your paintings. So I think an excellent kind of historical example of using negative space effectively is Japanese art, where I'm going to show an example here. There's tons of negative space in this artwork. There is very little that's actually painted in this, and it is done masterfully. It's so effective, and it almost gives a pictorial representation of kind of that Zen and that enlightenment mood that they are trying to reflect in the painting. And it can really embrace the simplicity of nature. And so you can see that it looks complex in its simplicity. It's amazing. And it's done so masterfully. If you move on to more modern examples, you have like your cubists and your modern artists, impressionists. All of these painters used negative space and negative painting effectively. And then more modern, you have tons of artists, especially I go to like urban sketching. A lot of urban sketchers use a lot of negative space in their drawings and paintings, and they will leave whole areas just completely unpainted. And again, that really helps define the focal point. It also helps make the drawing and the painting faster. So if you get to where you can successfully create compositions with a lot of negative space, you're going to be able to capture moments more quickly, which if you're, doing things out on the street and urban sketching, you might want to practice that skill. All right, so I'm going to grab a paper and we're going to try to recreate this composition, but incorporating negative space. All right, so I grabbed this bee-inspired watercolor pad. I've never used this paper, so we'll see how it goes. So that's going to be another kind of fun, maybe possibly challenge to this painting. And let me move these examples out of the way. I'm just going to start by grabbing a little bit of paint, and I'm going to use leftovers that were in my palette from previous paintings because, again, this is just kind of practice and trying to learn and explore different styles here. So just going to use some kind of grayish purple, and I'm going to get in this kind of foreground element here and just kind of dot it in there. There we go. Okay, and then I'm going to get in the cliff back here. I want to make that a little bit more orange. And I'm just now planning my composition. So that's the first step here, is to just plan the composition and figure out where everything's going to go and where the negative space is going to be. Okay, so I think I want this cliff to come out a little bit farther. And so I'm going to come here and just kind of draw out the edge of the cliff. There we go. And then the bottom's going to come in here. And then there's going to be kind of an area that comes out this way. Okay. And then same thing here. And then that's going to come around this direction. Okay. And then we can add in a little bit where we're going to add in like a cliff edge here. There we go. Okay. Now, I think that I'm going to draw in my shoes where they're kind of coming out over, and I don't want it to be centered this time. So I'm going to come up this way just a little bit and draw in the shoe. So there's the edge, and then it comes around. There we go. Okay, and then kind of pant leg. Okay, and then I can do the other one here. Okay, and then again, kind of a pant leg here. There we go. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave that negative space and I'm going to leave all of this middle part negative space. And so that's kind of the beginning of my composition. Now I'm going to go ahead and get in some vivid orange into the cliffs, okay? And here I'm going to use dry brushing, which I did use in my original painting as well. So I'm going to try to do it a little bit better though, if that makes sense. So leaving more white space basically. Okay. And maybe add a little bit more, make it a little bit more brown. For another layer here. Okay, and I can let it kind of fade out as I come over toward the edge. Maybe add a little bit of green because there was some green in the hills, but a very muted green. So I'm using olive and kind of mixing it with just junk that's in the palette to get a very muted green. Add some of that in. And kind of define the edge here a little bit because there was like a subtle slope down and then just a cliff face. So kind of blend that out. There we go. And then kind of the same thing back here. There's another layer of that green. Change the direction of the brush strokes a little bit, just to create some more movement. Up onto that hill area. Okay, and then that brings us to our next part is where we're really using contrast now to define. So we have the obviously going to be the white of the negative space, and then we're going to contrast that with some darks to create interest. Okay, so I'm going to get in some dark kind of craggy areas. Okay. Where there's deep dark shadows. And this was a very bright sunny day, so there's going to be very deep shadows in some areas. So I'm just using a dark that is mixed in my palette already. And I'm not doing solid lines here, but I am doing very dark. Okay. So I'm doing some kind of horizontal shadows, and then I'll do some vertical shadows and just kind of tap them in. We have some dark, craggy areas. And some are going to be bigger than others, some are going to be darker. Okay. Okay. Now the bottom of the cliff is going to be a lot more red. So Get my cadmium scarlet, mix in some red with it, and this is perline maroon, so it's a very dark, rich red color. And we're going to get that in to this edge of this cliff. And I'll probably add some darks in there too. Now, right along the edge, I want to make sure that I create that contrast again. So that's that second step, create the contrast between the negative space and the positive space. Okay. Okay, and then I'm going to add some darks in. Where shadows might be. And I'm just messing with it. Obviously, I don't have a reference photo. I'm literally using my sketch from on the site as my reference. So I have no idea where shadows actually were in this hill, or in this cliff, but it doesn't really matter that much because it's nature and it's not precise. Pieces break off and then there's a sharp shadow there where there might be kind of a cave or whatever, right? So just getting some shadows in will help create interest and depth. Okay, this back one I'm leaving a little bit more faded out because I don't want to draw too much attention to it there. Now we'll get some more of the green. That's very brown. My brush is very dirty. Okay. Tap in some green. Maybe there's a little cactus or something on the edge. Yeah. Okay, so I'm already liking this better. And it's going to be simple and it's going to be messy, but that's okay. I'm okay with it being simple and messy. Okay, so this was kind of like a sandy brown area up here. So I'm going to use some yellow ochre, add a little bit of green because there is foliage. And then kind of use that loosely in here. And go around my shoes and my pants. So this is using negative painting here. And so I'm using the color to really define the shape. I already drew it out or sketched it out, but I am defining it further with this extra step here where I'm painting around. So I'm creating kind of interest and using that negative space, creating interesting shapes. So it's not just like straight. You can see I have jagged edges and it's not just straight areas here. So it's important to use shape design to help add interest as well. Okay, I'm going to add more green to some areas and just kind of tap that in. Again, there is foliage. It's kind of cactusy. And so it's a very muted green. And then I'm going to add my trees. So I'm just going to mix some green with some cadmium scarlet to create an orange. To create a brown. And then to darken it a little bit, I'm going to add some ultramarine. There we go. And I'm going to add a tree. So I'm going to put it just kind of right here. And it's kind of be hanging off the edge. So the roots are going to go across the edge here just to make it a little bit more interesting too. And it is wet, so you're going to see bleeds into the ground here, and I'm okay with that. And then we're just going to bring that up. And I'm going to bring it all the way up off the page just to make it kind of an interesting vertical element here. Okay. And then there's some little branches coming off. Some of them are going to have kind of leaves or whatever, needle thingies. Some of them aren't. Okay. Essentially, there is my tree, and I'm not going to touch the trunk too much more. I am going to touch the bottom here to blend it out, and kind of make it appear shadowed there at the bottom. Okay. And then I'm going to add another one over here because that's what I had in my original composition. So just to kind of stay true to that a little bit. Oops. Fix the roots here so that it looks like it's in the ground. And this one's not as tall. It's kind of a more stubby little bushy tree. There we go. And I think I'm just going to edit out this other little tree because I don't like it. And then I'm just going to take some greens and kind of tap those in. And here I'm using negative space as well. So I'm not connecting those greens to everything. I don't really care if they connect that much because there's space and there's air in trees and bushes and plants. So I heard once, you got to make sure your birds can fly through it. So you want to make sure that it's not just a solid clump. And so leaving white space in between is a nice way to make sure that your foliage reads foliage and not just a dense blob. Okay, we're going to add some darker colors in there. So I'm going to get some ultramarine and kind of tap that in as well for some shadow areas. And I'm just kind of tapping around and letting it mix on the page a little bit. Toward the trunk, I'm adding the darkers basically because it would be more shadowed there. Add just a little bit of that blue into the trunk and the roots to get some darks and some shadows in. Okay, adding some blue to these, and I'm kind of just dabbing. I'm not doing anything crazy to create these shapes. Okay, now I'm going to add some yellow. So clean my brush really good and get some nice dark yellow. So this is just lemon yellow. It's semi-opaque, so it's going to go over as long as you have enough paint on the brush. It'll go over some of the lighter colors. And so I'm just tapping that in, especially toward the top and the left, because that's where I decided my light's coming from, by putting the shadow on the right side of the trunk. Okay. There we go. Now I'm going to add a little bit of kind of a spiky plant bush down here, coming out kind of from the base of this tree. Maybe it's growing out right next to it. Add some darks in. Okay. And then add a little bit of dark at the bottom, kind of shadow. Okay. kind of round around me here. So again, this is where I'm adding a little bit more contrast around the negative shape or the negative space to create a little bit more of that focal point. And then we're going to leave that negative space really simple. So either don't touch it at all or add just very minimal details like I did in the shoes here. I just added some minimal detail with the shoelaces to read shoes, but I'm going to leave the rest unpainted because it reads as legs and shoes. I don't need to add more to it. And that's important because you don't want to add a bunch to your negative space because then that will make it no longer really negative space, right? Kind of defining the edge of this a little bit more. Add that contrast in. Over here's a little bit darker because there's maybe more shadows. Add a little bit of green in. Okay, now I have to decide if I want to add a background cliff here. And if not, do I want to add like sky or something? Now it's definitely, the canyon is here, so it drops down and there's a river back here, or like down here. You can't see the river. And so this would be the back wall of the canyon. So if I'm going to add that, I need to make sure I do it in a way where it doesn't detract from this front one. So I'm going to do a very light orange and just kind of paint vertical brush strokes up. Add a little bit of yellow ochre. Okay. There we go. Now just define kind of the edge of this a tad bit more. I don't want it to be blending in too much with the background. There we go. Okay, so that is basically the same composition, but using a whole lot more negative space. Now, you can decide what you like better. It's completely a style choice, right? I feel like this looks really cluttered and this looks a lot cleaner. Also, this was a lot faster. So in terms of doing it on site, like if I would have done this instead, it would have been a lot faster. And I think it's still very effective. It reads as, you know, your Arizona cliffs. You know, this, I don't know how much it reads like Grand Canyon anyway, right? You can see the cliff, but you can't see down into where the river is. So just the view that I had, it's a little bit hard to tell specifically that it's a Grand Canyon, but it doesn't matter. If I cared, I could write on it, right? Maybe I'd use the negative space to add text. If you're doing travel type sketching, that's a good use of negative space as well. You can go in and add text later if you want to ground it and remind you where it is. But this is just kind of showing you the difference between using negative space and not using negative space. So kind of the last step is to take a step back and make sure that the negative space is what you want. And if it's not, go in and edit it. You can always go in and edit and change your negative space a little bit. So taking steps back from your work frequently is going to help you kind of have an editorial eye as you're painting versus just go, 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 keep painting, keep adding more. Take a step back and see when you want to stop and where you want to preserve that negative space. So some common mistakes for negative space in painting is just overfilling the page, right? So again, it's a stylistic choice. You can fill the whole page with paint, that's fine. But overfilling it is going to make it have that overworked feel. A lot of people talk about a painting being overworked, or I like to call it tortured. Whenever I overwork a painting, I'm like, man, I tortured that. But overfilling the page is kind of one of your common mistakes. A second one is adding too much detail into the negative space. So again, it's negative space. It's supposed to be a spot for the eye to rest in the painting. And if you add a bunch of detail into that, you're going to take away from the effect of the negative space. And then the other two kind of common mistakes kind of go together. Number one is not planning ahead. In watercolor especially, you don't have to have the whole thing planned, but you need to make sure that you're preserving those negative spaces because you can't go back and get them back by painting over it. So planning ahead is going to be very important to prevent losing those negative spaces. And then again, specific to watercolor is not preserving the highlights. So again, you cannot paint highlights in watercolor. You can add it in different mediums, and that's fine. You can use pastel pencils, you can use gouache, you can use acrylic paint, gesso, whatever, but you cannot add those highlights or regain those highlights without adding another medium. So it's important to preserve those highlights. So as a final takeaway to this, if your painting feels off or heavy, it's often not what you've actually painted, but what you haven't painted. That is the problem. So keep that in mind as you're planning your next watercolor composition. So if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And if you are interested in continuing to grow your skills in watercolor, check out my channel and subscribe. I have tons of educational, kind of informational type videos and also real-time video tutorials that you can follow step by step to help grow your techniques and your skills as a watercolor artist. Thank you so much for watching. And until next time, keep those paints flowing.